in August of 1976 is the year I started law school here at Case. And the first thing I did is I wanted to do international law, so I sought our only professor of international law, Sidney Picker, and I went to meet with him, and the first thing he told me is he goes, "I'm starting this Canada-United States Law Institute. It's going to be so much fun." And I was listening to him, and I said, "Yeah, that's great. Count me in. I'm there." So I feel like I've been here from the ground floor, and I'm now the U.S. National Director. My name is Steve Petrus, and it's an honor to have this position. And to kick us off for welcoming remarks is our United States co-chair, Jim Blanchard. Jim, former governor of Michigan, former U.S. ambassador to Canada, partner at DLA Piper. Jim, floor is yours.
Steve, thank you very much, and thank you for your leadership. It is truly appreciated, and I hope at some point we'll acknowledge the staff that does a lot of the work, because they really do. And your counterpart, Kai Carmody, thank you again for your leadership from Western Ontario. Are they calling it Western now, or is it still called Western Ontario Law School? Western Ontario, all right. It's the center of the universe. And Dean Scharf, and Dean Chamberlain going to be with us? No. All right. Well, anyway, we appreciate your leadership. I've been coming to these things for quite a while, and I have a couple of little pieces of information I want to give you, and I made some notes. First of all, you mentioned Sidney Picker. It was his brainchild, and we're all very grateful for that. He had actually attended a few of these a few years ago. He's no longer with us, but he is the guiding light. But the guy that gave it other energy, though, was this Henry King, who used to ring this bell. And I don't know how many of you knew of him or know him, but he was really an extraordinary person. Lawyer, statesman. What we always thought that was really interesting was that he had, as a young man, been a prosecutor at Nuremberg during the post-war era. And he worked with Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson. And Robert Jackson was on the Supreme Court. He was like this with FDR, played cards with him, had dinner with him. He had been Solicitor General, Attorney General, and on the Supreme Court, and he didn't even have a law degree. So if those of you who are law students, don't get the idea. In those days, you could read law and get your license. It's pretty fascinating. But he was like that with FDR. And so FDR says, right as the war ends, he says, "I want you to go over and do the thing. You don't have to give up being a Supreme Court. I want you to run the Nuremberg trials," which is what he did. It's a fascinating thing to know about. Now, you're going to hear from, I think at one point, my co-chair, Jim Peterson, who's a former member of Parliament and Trade Minister in Canada. And he's a special person, along with my law partner, Rick Newcomb. Rick Newcomb has really been supported. He's a graduate of Case Western Reserve Law School, and he is a leader. Rick is a leader in international law all over the world, and including, of course, in Washington, D.C. So we're thrilled to have him here every year and being a strong supporter and getting our law firm to support. In fact, I think Rick has recruited Christy Balsanac, who's going to be part of the environmental discussion tomorrow. I don't think she's coming in the morning, I think, but we're happy that she's going to be here. And I'm especially happy that a professor from my alma mater, Michigan State University, is going to be here tomorrow. I don't think she's arrived yet, but her name is Winona Single, and she's Director of Indigenous Law and Policy and has a Law and Policy Center at MSU. I'm really excited about that. She's a professor of law. It's a big deal. This conference is a big deal. You guys are really, somebody else is talking. You guys, by the way, this is a wonderful turnout. Thank you, thank you. I also, yes. And I'm going to introduce tomorrow Colin Bird, who is the Consul General from Canada, stationed in Detroit. It's a special consulate, as he will tell you, because it's the busiest. The Michigan, Ontario, Canada, US, Detroit, Windsor connections are really the cradle of our cooperation. And when you're consul general in Detroit, you actually are dealing with Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana. You're dealing with every kind of trade issue, immigration, everything you can imagine, including the upcoming Gordie Howe Bridge, which is another story. But we always appreciate you, and the consul has been very helpful over the years. Thank you. Thank you. You can clap if you want. I can hear you. That's good. Now, we also have, will be joining us is someone named Rebecca Mallowan. She is the new director of the Canada Institute at Michigan State University. I mentioned those two because I'm very proud of their connections. And I'm glad she's going to be here, and this is a great thing because she's new at that, but not new to Canadian issues. So I'm really, really happy about that. Finally, what else did I want to say other than you got a great crowd? I learned the other night, this is weird. I'm having dinner with my pal Todd Sedgwick. He is a philanthropist, an outdoorsman. He organized sportsmen for Obama and Biden. He's originally from Cleveland, although the Sedgwick name sounds, rather interesting. Well, his ancestors signed not the Declaration of Independence, but they signed the Constitution or whatever. They are part of the Founding Fathers. And he's from Cleveland, although he's been living in Washington, D.C. More recently. But when I told him I was coming here, he was all excited. And he told me something that the dean and the others can check out. He said his great-great-grandfather gave this all land to either to Case Western or to Cleveland. His name was J.H. Wade. And it was supposed to name this Wade Circle or something, right? But they also named it universities, whatever it was. So anyway, Todd wanted me to remind you about this, because he wanted his great-grandpa to be happy. And I think with this crowd, he's going to be very happy, and you're going to be happy with the program that we're about to give you. Thank you.
All right, so just a brief summary of how the evening will progress. We have a couple of awards to issue and one remembrance to make before we actually have dinner. And then we're going to have dinner, and then we're going to have our keynote presentation from Dean Scharf. So let me begin the program first by doing a couple of things. I would like to recognize initially the Executive Committee of the Canada-United States Law Institute. You've met our co-chair from the United States, Jim Blanchard. We also have a co-chair in Canada, Jim Peterson, former Minister of International Trade for Canada. He's going to give a presentation in a few moments. Our co-presidents are Dean Erica Chamberlain from the University of Western Ontario, Faculty of Law, and our own Michael Scharf, co-dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Our Canadian National Chair is Kai Carmody. As I mentioned, I'm the U.S. National Chair. I'm a National Director. Our co-managing directors are Ted Perrin, who could not be here tonight, and Steve Paley. Steve, right over there. And finally, our members of our executive committee. And if you could raise your hand or stand up when I call your name, those who are here. We have Diane Francis, right there. Martha Hall Finley, who can't be here tonight. James Graham, who can't be here tonight. Larry Herman, there's Larry over there. Peter McKay.
Larry's the George Washington.
That's right, Larry's the George Washington of our. Peter McKay, Rick Newcomb, right over there. Christopher Sands, who, if he's not here, he's going to be here soon. He'll be here tomorrow. And Raul Rosado. Raul, where are you? Over there. Okay. Thank you guys for being involved. Also, I'd like to give a special thanks and shout out to our sponsors, because we can't do these programs without sponsorship. A gold sponsor this year is the Consulate General of Canada in Detroit. Our silver sponsors are the law firm of Blake, Castles, and Graydon in Canada, and Pile Dynamics, and GRL Engineers. Our bronze sponsors are Baker & Hostetler, Barrett in America, Formica Corporation, Richard Newcomb, Richard Pogue, the Government of Quebec office in Chicago, and Taft Stettinius. And finally, our community partners who help us promote this event and spread the good word, including the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, the Council of the Great Lakes Region, the Greater Cleveland International Lawyers Group, the Northern Ohio District Export Council, the Ohio Aerospace Institute, and the Wilson Center through its Canada Institute. So I'd like to give them a big round of applause. So at this time, I'd like to ask to come to the podium Larry Herman. We lost a dear friend this past year, and Larry's going to give us a tribute. Larry.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's an honor for me to pay tribute to Michael Robinson, a long-standing member of Cooley who died in Toronto last month. Those of us in the room who knew Michael are saddened by his passing, and we miss him a great deal. Michael was a personal friend of mine and of many of you for decades, for over 40 years. And for much of that time, he and I drove down from Toronto to Cleveland to attend these conferences. Michael was a well-known, extremely respected international commercial lawyer, an expert in international project finance, and a prominent member a prominent member in Canadian legal and international legal circles. He was a leading member of the International Bar Association. But it was Michael's long-standing devotion and involvement in CUSLI, in the Canada-US Law Institute, and its objectives in furthering bilateral understanding between our two countries that he is to be remembered and praised for. He was a member of the Advisory Council and the Executive Committee of the organization for many years. He was a long-standing friend of Henry King and Sidney Picker, whose names were mentioned by Stephen in introducing tonight's session. He was the most consistent participant and attender of these conferences for 4 decades. I think he didn't miss one of our conferences for 40 years. He was well known not only as a member of the executive, but as a participant, always making pertinent observations. He's remembered in particular for a debate on the softwood lumber dispute between Canada and the United States that resonates in the books of our organization. Always amusing questions and observations from the floor. Michael was a fine Canadian, a highly respected lawyer, and a great supporter and friend of this organization. We mourn his passing, but we celebrate his achievements for CUSLI over these many years. Michael, you will always be remembered by your many friends and colleagues and in the annals of this institute. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. We will miss Michael. He always had a very provocative question to ask. So, the next item on the agenda is the Henry King Award. The Henry King Award is meant to recognize someone who has provided great service to our institute and honors Henry King, who is known to many of us here. He served for many years as the United States National Director and created many of the traditions upon which this conference is based. This year, it is particularly fitting that we focus on human rights as the topic of our conference because Henry was, as mentioned, the youngest prosecutor at Nuremberg. We will hear more about that later with Dean Scharf's remarks. This year's recipient of the Henry King Award is Carina Van Vliet. Carina serves as the Chief Executive Officer of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs. She has held that position since January of 2019, and she leads that organization and its dedicated staff of professionals in the execution of the mission of the Cleveland Council to inspire engagement in international affairs. This mission includes the promotion of human rights. So let me tell you a little bit about Carina. She was born to American parents and raised in Cannes, France. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Bowdoin College in Maine. And by the way, the motto at Bowdoin is the common good, which truly describes Carina. She got her master's degree in international relations from the National Political Science Institute in Paris. Interestingly enough, she was in the class of 1999, and Emmanuel Macron was in the class of 2001. What's interesting is that many of France's presidents have been graduates of that school, so who knows what lies in the future for Carina. Carina also obtained her Master of Arts at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And with that education and background, she was also a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations from 2011 to 2016. Her international education and interests have taken her to many parts of the world and involved her in many interesting endeavors. She actually taught international economics for a year in the People's Republic of China. She moved to New York City and became the Director of Policy and Leadership Programs at the French-American Foundation. And she also co-authored an economics history book in French. Then with her background and interests, she eventually, and perhaps inevitably, took a position at the United Nations, where she served as a political affairs officer from 2006 to 2014, covering Latin America and the Middle East, disarmament affairs, women, peace, and security issues. And she was also a senior advisor to the 2015 Nobel Peace Prize Forum. Of interest to us here at the Canada-United States Law Institute is that she met her husband, Grant Goodrich, in Germany in a language program. He had just graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy, and this was just before his infantry training to become an officer in the United States Marine Corps. And by the way, Grant has been a panelist at our annual conferences on climate change in 2019, as he is an expert on sustainable energy. In 2015, Grant got a job here at Case Western Reserve University in the engineering department as the director of the Great Lakes Engineering Institute. So since 2015, Carina came to Cleveland and became the regional manager for business development and communications at Jones Day. She held that position until 2018, when she became the CEO of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs. Her ties to Canada and the Canada-United States Law Institute arise primarily from two things. First, under her leadership, the Cleveland Council on World Affairs has been a consistent and dedicated community partner to our institute and has consistently promoted our programs and conferences. And we are very grateful for that. Second, having been born in France, she speaks French fluently. However, she speaks fluent English with no accent. As a result, everyone thinks she must be Canadian. So in recognition of her service to our institute and to the long long-term community partnership of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs. We're pleased to present to Karina this year's Henry T. King Jr. Award. Karina.
Well, thank you very much for this honor. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And thank you for mentioning the special partnership that the Cleveland Council on World Affairs has had with CUSLI. It's been a long-standing one, and we're delighted to be a community partner every year. And I would say there's a very simple reason for that. As Steve said, the mission of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs is to inspire engagement in international affairs. And a lot of times when I'm talking to our fellow Clevelanders about why it's important to engage in international affairs, and some people look at me and say, well, we've got a lot of domestic issues, and we've got a lot of poverty in East Cleveland, we've got all these other things we're thinking about as Americans, and international affairs seems kind of distant and foreign. And I say, you know what? Look north, because right there is our closest foreign neighbor, Canada. And so I think it is important for us as Ohioans to acknowledge the special relationship between our two countries. And I was also the desk officer for Canada at the United Nations. So thank you again for this recognition, and thank you for acknowledging the Cleveland Council on World Affairs.
Okay, so the next item on the agenda is the award, the Sidney J. Picker Award. And that award is going to be presented by Jim Peterson, who joins us virtually from Canada, Jim being our Canadian co-chair.
I'm delighted to be here. And I would have preferred that I was with all of you in Cleveland, but unfortunately couldn't make it. But over the years, I've very much enjoyed working with CUSLI, and especially my co-chair, Jim Blanchard, and all of our directors from both Canada and the United States. Today, we're happy to present the Sidney J. Picker Award to Wayne Garnons Williams. Sidney Picker was an extremely well-respected professor of international law at Case Western School of Law. And it's he who came up with the idea that Canada and the United States should create the Law Institute in 1976. CUSLI is his vision, which brings us all here today, 48 years later. For many years now, we've recognized lawyers who have contributed greatly to Canada-U.S. relations by giving them the Sidney Picker Award. Wayne is one such lawyer, and he's no stranger to our institute, having participated in the past in our conferences and research initiatives. He is a true expert on the laws of First Nations, Indigenous communities, and American Indian tribes. By birth, he is a Plains Cree from Treaty 6 of Moosomin. He is experienced firsthand the practice of the Canadian government removing Indigenous children from their homes and placing them in non-Indigenous families. As many of you know, Canada is trying to heal these wounds, and Wayne himself plays a big role in that process by being the founding chair and now acting CEO of the National 60s Scoop Healing Foundation of Canada. Wayne got his Bachelor of Laws degree from Queen's University, a Master of Public Administration from Dalhousie, and his Master of Laws with a Specialty of Indigenous International Law from the University of Oklahoma College of Law. Wayne's Master of Law Research thesis was an exploration of the legal history, law, and policy of Indigenous trade between Canada and the United States. He's called to the bars in Ontario and British Columbia and practiced law as a civil litigation lawyer with the Department of Justice of Canada. As Senior Environmental Indigenous Law Specialist with the Sierra Legal Defense Fund, now known as Eco Justice. Wayne climbed the management ranks of the Canadian federal government in various senior law management roles, including Registrar and Deputy Head of the Federal Court of Canada, and creator and founding Deputy Head and Register of the Specific Claims Tribunal. He is now the Senior Lawyer and Principal Director of the law firm Garwell Law Professional Corporation. Further, he leads an international business entitled Indigenous Sovereign Trade Consultancy Limited, specializing in tribal trade and sustainable economic development. He is the founding president of the International Intertribal Trade and Investment Organization, past board secretary of the Council of Great Lakes Region, past chair of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations, Appeal Tribal, past chair of the National Council of Federal Aboriginal Employers, and is currently on the board of directors of the International Law Association. The Canadian chapter is one of the founding members of the Government of Canada Global Affairs Working Group on Indigenous International Trade. Wayne was instrumental in advising on the development of Canada's Indigenous trade policy, which led to progress for Indigenous trade. And the People's Economic Trade and Cooperation Arrangement was part of his work. He was appointed by Order in Council as a member of the NAFTA Chapter 19 Trade Remedies roster, and then as a CUSMA Advisory Committee member on the Private Commercial Disputes Article 31. He's also a research fellow specializing in international comparative Indigenous law at the University of Oklahoma College of Law, as well as legal fellow for the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. He is the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business Award winner for excellence in Aboriginal relationships. He won the Queen's Alumni Award as well for his work on International Legal Specialist and Peace, Justice, and Governance Award, and from the Center of International Sustainable Development Law. He has recently written and is co-editing a textbook to be published by Cambridge University Press next year on international Indigenous trade and environmental law, and is published on Indigenous international trade in relation to intellectual property. He's teaching a course based on this textbook as part of the Bachelor of Indigenous Entrepreneurialism program at the University of Waterloo. Wayne, your life has been one of outstanding achievement. I would ask everybody here to join me in congratulating Wayne as being this year's recipient of the Sidney J. Picker Award.
Things that I learned as a litigator is the three B's: be up, be brief, be gone. So I will thank the Canadian United States Law Institute, and this is the beginning of an ongoing relationship with my organization, the International Intertribal Trade and Investment Organization, contributing annually to the Canada-United States Law Institute's work. So we're looking forward to furthering that development. And with that, I thank you very much for this great honor. Thank you.
Okay, so now it's time to eat. We'll take a break, we'll eat, and then come back for our keynote presentation. We have our keynote presentation by Dean Michael Scharf, and then there will be questions and answers, and afterwards, dessert and cocktails will be available, and we'll also have music by Raising the Bar, which is the law school band made up of law school faculty and students, led by our own Dean, Michael Scharf. So let me introduce to you a man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. It's Dean Michael P. Scharf. He's president of the Canada-United States Law Institute and dean of Case Western Reserve School of Law. Michael Scharf has been the co-dean of our law school since 2013, and he is also the Joseph C. Baker Hostetler Professor of Law, and serves as the managing director of the Public International Law and Policy Group, which is actually a Nobel Peace Prize nominated NGO. Dean Scharf attended Duke University School of Law and served in the Office of the Legal Advisor of the United States State Department, where he held the position of Attorney Advisor for Law Enforcement and Intelligence, Attorney Advisor for the United Nations Affairs, and Delegate to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. He has authored 20 books, 5 of which have won National Book of the Year honors. He's the recipient of Case Western Reserve University School of Law Alumni Association's Distinguished Teacher Award, and Ohio Magazine's Excellence in Education Award. And he continues to teach international law and was ranked as among the most cited authors in the field of human rights. He has many interesting assignments in his career, including training judges for the trial of Saddam Hussein and serving as special assistant prosecutor of the Cambodia Genocide Tribunal. He has argued before the appeals chamber of the International Criminal Court at The Hague, and that was interesting because I actually watched that while he did it. Since 2011, Dean Scharf has been the producer and host of a radio show called Talking Foreign Policy, which is broadcast by Cleveland's NPR station and also broadcast by NPR affiliates across the country. In 2019, Dean Scharf was selected for life membership in the Council of Foreign Relations. And in 2020, he was elected president of the American branch of the International Law Association. In 2021, he was elected executive counsel of the American Society of International Law. So our own Michael Scharf.
Good evening, everybody. It's really a great privilege to have been asked to deliver the keynote address in my last year as co-dean of the law school and as co-president of the Canada-US Law Institute. You're actually in for a double helping of Scharf this evening, as you heard, because I'll also be performing. I play the guitar and sing with our law school band, Raising the Bar. That's spelled R-A-Z-I-N-G. The law students came up with that name. They said it was subversive. And Kelsey DeMonte, who I see right there, she designed our logo. It is a flaming scales of justice. So that's what it means. This conference, which is focusing on the economics of human rights, corresponds with the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we did put on each of your chair a little mini version of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know how all those constitutional law professors and litigators always pull out their pocket constitution? Well, now you international lawyers can do that with the Universal Declaration. Oh, and I noticed on the back, fact that it's branded Case Western Reserve. So. My remarks tonight will focus on the unique role that this law school has played in the struggle for international human rights and accountability over the last 75 years. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights arose from the horrors of the Holocaust. The leading perpetrators were brought to justice before history's first International Criminal Tribunal at Nuremberg, Germany. Prior to the negotiation of the charter and judgment of the Nuremberg Tribunal, there was no such thing as international human rights. What a country did to its own citizens in its own territory was no other country's business but that country's. That all changed with the judgment of the Nuremberg Tribunal, which established the principle that state officials could be prosecuted for the atrocities that they commit at home and abroad. That principle made it possible for the international community, under the leadership of U.S. Permanent Representative to the UN, Eleanor Roosevelt, to agree on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Declaration paved the way for the negotiation of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And together, these three instruments are considered the International Bill of Rights. While global enforcement has been uneven, their impact is undeniable. They have been cited in numerous international and domestic court cases in the United States and throughout the world. Now, most of you know that this law school has had a special connection to the Nuremberg Tribunal, and you've heard about Henry King tonight. But what you might not know is that it began 20 years before Henry King's arrival at our doors. One of Robert Jackson's senior prosecutors at Nuremberg was Sidney Jacoby. He joined our faculty after the Nuremberg trial, and he taught civil procedure here for 20 years. Now, Henry King was at the time of Nuremberg the youngest Nuremberg prosecutor. He was just 2 years older than our third-year law students here today. And he ended up following in Professor Jacoby's footsteps, teaching international arbitration and serving as the director of the Canada-US Law Institute here for 30 years before his passing in 2009. In his final years, Henry was also proudly serving as Honorary Consul General of Canada to Ohio, a position that is now occupied by his protege, Dan Utso. Dan, you want to stand up for a sec? It was really Henry who made the annual conference what it is today. He recruited the co-chairs of the Keynote Executive Committee, and Governor Blanchard, thank you for being with us today. Jim Peterson, who you saw on Zoom, thank you for joining us that way. He also recruited many of the current members. He recruited the co-sponsors. In the early years of this conference, he would make phone calls and make sure that he would fill the room. Governor Blanchard asked me to make sure this room was filled, and I did the same thing, I can tell you. Are you satisfied with our group here? So 23 years ago, Henry recruited another war crimes specialist, yours truly, to follow in his footsteps here at the school. I had met Henry when I was attorney advisor for UN Affairs at the US Department of State, when I was working on the creation of the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal. And at that time, we spoke at length with Henry King and Ben Ferenz and Whitney, what's his last name? The one, Harris, thank you, at Washington University, the three surviving members of the American delegation at Nuremberg. And they gave us all kinds of wonderful guidance. And we basically dusted off the old Nuremberg Tribunal statute, updated it with modern human rights law, and created the modern tribunals statute for Yugoslavia. That tribunal statute was then replicated for the Rwanda tribunal. Very similar statute was used for the special court for Sierra Leone, and the ICC looks an awful lot like that statute. Now, after I arrived at Case, Henry supported my efforts to launch our International Tribunal Internship Program and a summer abroad program in the Netherlands that focused on international criminal law, and an international criminal law LLM degree, and the War Crimes Watch e-newsletter, and the Cox Center Award for Advancing Global Justice. And finally, what is now called the Henry King War Crimes Research Office, whose assistance to international tribunals was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. And at that time, our own Professor Jim Johnson, who I see right there, was the lead trial attorney at the Special Court for Sierra Leone. His supervising attorney was David Crane. And David and Jim and his colleagues were inundated by a lot of really difficult legal issues. And they didn't have the time or resources that we had at our school. So we entered into an MOU with them, and my students deep dived into it. And they worked on issues like, could the head of state of Liberia, Charles Taylor, be prosecuted in a hybrid court? And it was clear after Nuremberg that he could be prosecuted in an international court because there's no head of state immunity at an international court. But what about a court that is partly international and partly national? And that took a lot of research. We looked at the issue of whether somebody could be convicted of recruiting and using child soldiers, which had never been prosecuted before an international tribunal up to that time. And we looked at 50 other legal issues that they assigned to us. And in the end, David Crane nominated our program for the Nobel Peace Prize. Our students, for their research, got that recognition. So that's pretty cool. Now, Henry was a master of organizing conferences and expert meetings. And through the years, he helped me pull together important academic gatherings on cutting-edge issues, such as torture and the war on terrorism, resulting in something called the Cleveland Principles in the Treatment of Detainees. That was a document signed by over 500 academics around this country at the time when America was holding hundreds of sometimes innocent people and waterboarding them at Guantanamo Bay. Now, Henry also encouraged me to spend a sabbatical as a assistant to the chief prosecutor of the Cambodia Genocide Tribunal. And he advised me when I trained the judges for the trial of Saddam Hussein. As my mentor, I think he would have been extremely proud when I became the first American to present an amicus argument before the appeals chamber in the International Criminal Court last year. When I became dean 11 years ago, I took a page from Henry's book, and I recruited yet another war crimes expert by the name of Jim Johnson, who I just mentioned to you, to take our program to the next level. Jim, I'm really glad you came tonight. You had no idea I was going to say all these nice things. I met Jim when he was the chief trial counsel in the trial of Liberian President Charles Taylor before the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And I can tell you that Jim and his colleagues became household names when they called supermodel Naomi Campbell to the stand. I'm going to tell you the story briefly. Jim says I always exaggerate this, but I think it's pretty much actual. So basically, it's close. Yeah, it's been a couple of years, but basically, Charles Taylor's up there saying, "Look, I didn't give any weapons to the rebels in Sierra Leone who were committing all of these atrocities, and I didn't get anything from them. I've never heard of blood diamonds. That's not my thing." So they call Naomi Campbell to the stand, and Naomi says, yes, they say, "Tell us about when you met the defendant." And she goes, "Well, I went to a party at Nelson Mandela's house in South Africa, and in comes the Liberian president with his swagger, and he comes up to me and he says, 'Naomi, you are this beautiful supermodel. I really appreciate you, so I have something for you.' He reaches in his pocket and he pulls out a rough cut diamond. And it is a blood diamond, and he gives it to her, and in the end, she turns it over to authorities, and that's the diamond that convicted Charles Taylor. And so, good job, Jim Johnson. Now, since Jim's arrival, he has organized the International Humanitarian Law Roundtable at the Chautauqua Institute. And that is a retreat that, how many of our students here have been to that? Look at that. Okay, that's a retreat that our students get to go to, and all of the major international prosecutors and their staff members and academics get together at Lake Chautauqua at this institute in this old hotel, the Athenaeum. It's one of the two last remaining giant wooden hotels. The other one's the one at Mackinac Island. And we go there, and it's just a group thing, and we talk about the big issues facing the international tribunals. And they see it as their annual retreat. They love it, and our students get this opportunity to interact with them, and some of them end up getting jobs through that. And our band, which you're going to hear tonight, plays there, and it's really quite extraordinary. If anybody in this room wants to go in August, I can get you invited. It's really something. In addition, Jim created the Yemen Accountability Project, which is laying the groundwork for the prosecution of perpetrators of atrocities committed in the Yemen civil war. And here's another story. So we've all heard a little bit about the Houthis in the last couple of months, because they've been lobbing missiles at shipping in the region. And then just last week, they sent some missiles over to, or drones over to Israel. But before that, hardly anybody was paying attention to what was going on in Yemen. And the Yemen crisis is horrible. I mean, the things that are going on there are rivaling what are going on in Gaza, in Syria, in Sudan, in Myanmar, and in the Ukraine. It's really bad, but nobody's paying attention to it. Why is that? Because one side is being supported by Saudi Arabia, who has a lot of friends, including the United States. The other side is being supported by Iran, and nobody wants to mess with this. So there is no international effort to document this until Jim Johnson said, we should do it here. And so when our students come to our law school, they often say, I want to go to a place where I can have an impact after I graduate on the world. And Jim Johnson said, you can have an impact while you're here. And so he asked for volunteers, and over 50 students, mostly 1Ls, volunteered to be part of the Yemen Accountability Project. They've been doing this now for 6 years? 6 years. And it's averaged 50 to 60 students a year. They just published their, I want to say, 5th white paper. And also, they've been creating a crime base and a narrative, and basically all the tools that are required for either universal jurisdiction prosecutions in Europe or some future international tribunal to prosecute these crimes. How many of the students here have participated in the Yemen Accountability Project? Look at that. So congratulations to you guys. You know, I think Henry really would have enjoyed working with Jim, and he would have loved the topic of this year's Koosley Conference. Building on Henry's foundation, our human rights program is now recognized as one of the best in the world, and our international law program last year was ranked number 10 by US News and World Report, something we've been clawing our way up to all these years since Henry was here, and we finally got to the promised land, the top 10. Our success wouldn't be possible but for the incredible generosity of our alums. And I think, you know, one of the things that Jessica Berg and I are going to be remembered for in terms of our success is it turned out, to our surprise, we were pretty good fundraisers. So in the last 11 years, we've raised $80 million for this school, and we doubled the... we doubled the school's endowment, and some of those went to the international law program, and in particular to human rights work. So for example, I want to do a shout out for Bruce Klatsky, who just recently gave us $500,000 to make it possible for our Journal of International Law to be given to every American international law professor, so that it is likely to be cited as, you know, one of the most cited journals in all of the country or the world. How many of you are part of the Journal of International Law? Look at that, okay. So, you know, did I fill the room, Jim? And then there's Tim Geis. You know, Jim Johnson and I went to Tim Geis, and he has agreed to give us $10,000 a year to support the Yemen Accountability Project. This brings experts in to meet with our students, and it allows our students to interact with the people who eventually might be prosecuting. And then there's Austin Fragaman. Austin graduated from here and created the biggest immigration law firm in the world, and he had this idea that you could have a firm that did nothing but immigration law. Well, toward the end of his career, I said, you know, we do immigration law at our clinic, and we'd like to have a distinguished lecturer named after you, and we'd like to have money to support the growth of what we do, because we have a track record of saving people in asylum and refugee cases second to none. How many of you have done the clinic that does asylum and refugee immigration law? Anybody? Okay, well, you missed the boat on that one. That is incredible work. When you come to law school and you can actually save people from torture or death if they are sent home to a place where they'll be persecuted. So the last great project that Henry engaged in was the effort to get the negotiators of the Rome Diplomatic Conference to include the crime of aggression in the statute of the International Criminal Court. And he succeeded by going to Rome and getting the negotiators to have a reference to the crime of aggression. But it said it's not in the statute until the statute is amended. And it would take 10 years for that to happen. In 2010, I was at Kampala when the countries in the world agreed to that amendment. And they added the crime of aggression to the statute. It was a great symbolic victory. But you know what? Because of countries, including the United States, they put a whole bunch of barriers up. They were afraid of the crime of aggression. And it's those barriers that are currently preventing Vladimir Putin from being prosecuted by the International Criminal Court for the worst of his crimes. You may know that the ICC has indicted Putin for the crime of stealing children from the Ukraine and having them adopted in Russia. And just last month, there was a subsequent indictment that wasn't really in the press, so this might be news to some of you. It indicted his major general and his major admiral for indiscriminate shelling and attacks against civilians. But Putin should be indicted for the crime of aggression. That's the crime that Henry thought was most important about Nuremberg. And the United Nations is currently considering a proposal which is supported by Canada and by European allies to create an ad hoc tribunal outside of the ICC to make sure that Putin stands trial for that crime. Now, Henry always ended every speech with something inspirational. And you who know him know that he used to pound his fists on the table while making that final point. So my final fist-pounding point in Henry's honor has to do with supporting Ukraine. After Russia invaded Ukraine, it began a campaign of war crimes and crimes against humanity that rivaled some of the worst atrocities that Henry prosecuted at Nuremberg. The International Criminal Court, as I mentioned, has indicted Russian President Vladimir Putin and his top military and naval commanders for war crimes in the Ukraine. The International Bar Association recently asked me to lead a team of experts to train Ukrainian prosecutors and investigators on how to prosecute international environmental war crimes. Because Russia's not just attacking the people of Ukraine, it's attacking the environment. And so we're going to be going out to Krakow, Poland in October and spending time working through that. And part of the reason I was asked to do that is because my work with the Saddam Hussein case involved the only other time in history that a leader or any official was indicted and convicted of crimes of environmental war crimes. In the case of Saddam Hussein, you might know the story. He was one day traveling through a little town called Dujal, and someone tried to shoot at him. And maybe they didn't even try to shoot at him. Maybe it was just like a car backfiring, but he thought that they tried to shoot at him. And so he ordered that the city be destroyed and all the people be killed. But that's not all he did. He destroyed all of the date farms within a 100 miles radius, and he salted the earth so that nothing would ever grow there again. That's what he did to a town because he was mad, because he thought that they tried to kill him. Not only that, but the Southern Marsh Arabs had the audacity to try to do an uprising. So they were dependent on their version of the Everglades, and he cut off all the water supplies, and they dried up, and they died by the hundreds of thousands. So he was convicted, and his subordinates were convicted of those environmental war crimes. Now, what Russia's been doing is horrible too. Not only have they been attacking indiscriminately, but they've been doing things purposely to destroy the environment. For example, whenever they occupy areas in the Ukraine and there are mines, well, Russia doesn't want the mines. They have their own minerals. They don't want the competition. But what they do want to do is destroy the environment, so they flood the mines. And when you flood mines, you create environmental disasters that spread out for hundreds of miles with toxicity that is almost impossible to reverse. They also attacked the major dam and flooded downstream major farms and cities and towns and killed hundreds of thousands and destroyed the land. They've been putting so many landmines in the Ukraine that there are more there now than the DMZ in between North and South Korea. And their landmines are plastic, so they're almost impossible to find with metal detectors. For the next 10, 20, 30 years, farmers and little children are going to have their legs blown off because of the way Russia is conducting this war. And the worst thing that I just recently heard about was that they have been attacking the marine life in the ocean just off the coast. And hundreds of thousands of dolphins have been washing up. And there are pictures online that you can see of basically Putin attacking Flipper. What's that about? But that's what we're going to be prosecuting. Now, President Putin was banking on fracturing the West, when in fact, the opposite has occurred with unprecedented resolve. Canada and 50 other NATO allies have joined the United States in freezing Russian financial assets, imposing sanctions on Russia, and providing vital economic and military aid to the Ukraine in its time of need. When Russia repeatedly used its veto at the Security Council to prevent any resolutions, the United States and Canada and their allies utilized a long dormant procedure. For 50 years, it hadn't been used. It was called the Uniting for Peace mechanism. And what that does is it says when the Security Council is paralyzed by the veto, you can go to the General Assembly, and if you can get a 2/3 vote, the General Assembly can act. And they have acted. They passed the first resolution condemning Russia's crime of aggression, and they called it the crime of aggression. Next, they passed a resolution saying that when Russia had plebiscites in these occupied areas, they were invalid and had no international legal effect. Then they passed a resolution, probably most extraordinary of all, that removed Russia from the Human Rights Council. Then they passed a resolution that created a registry so that people in Ukraine who have lost their land, their loved ones, who have been injured, can register what happened to them. And all of those assets that have been frozen may one day go to compensate those individuals and rebuild the Ukraine. There is currently, and of course, we've got the most famous person when it comes to asset freezing and seizures here in the room with us. He was introduced before, but I want to do another shout out to Rick Newcomb, who was director of the Office of Foreign Assets Control, the Sanctions guy, for over 30 years. Did I have that right? 18 years? All right, I like to get it right. 18 years, still really impressive. I met him when I was at the State Department, and that was 30 years ago. So, so the world is now looking at how can they use these assets to make the Ukraine whole again. Now, with the US and Canada's support, Ukraine has been doing pretty well in its war against the Goliath that is Russia. They've reclaimed 2/3 of their eastern territory that Russia initially occupied. They valiantly have fought Russia to a standstill for 2 years. But the Ukraine is running out of ammunition, and Russia is biding its time. And now our Congress is dithering, with some members expressing the view that Putin doesn't present a threat beyond Ukraine. This isn't an interest of ours, or as Ross Perot would say, we don't have a dog in that fight. At Nuremberg, Henry King saw firsthand the price the world paid for failing to recognize Hitler's expansionist ambitions. If he were still here with us, he would raise his voice in moral outrage at the failure to continue to aid Ukraine. He would call for action. He would say, we can and must do better. Well, thank you all for being here, for listening to me as I channeled Henry King. Thank you for coming after we're done here for dessert. It's going to be make your own sundaes, and we have the bar open and raising the bar. The band will be playing right behind there. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, guys. Do you want me to do a couple of questions? Like 2? Yeah, go ahead. Okay. All right. Well, we have time for a couple of questions. So if you have any question about human rights law, international law, or anything in my field, I'm happy to chat with you about it. I should tell you that I was up at 3 o'clock this morning because I was giving a lecture in Austin, Texas, at University of Texas, and I had to get back here, and that was the only way to do so. So if my answers get a little loopy, I can't control that. But anyway, anybody? Yes.
What's your role in the band? What do you do?
What do I do in the band? You'll have to come over and see. I play the guitar and I sing. And I'll tell you the thing about our band. So we have students who are extraordinarily good singers, good musicians. And then we have me. And we have some faculty that are pretty decent. But my co-dean, Jessica Berg, was once asked, is Sharf any good? Because he's been playing in this band for a long time. You'd think I'd get better. And she says, let's just say he makes up for any lack of quality with his enthusiasm. So, yeah, that's what you'll see.
So my other question is, when you look at history, world history, whatever, who are your heroes?
Who are my heroes? I'm going to tell you a story that if you guys don't know it should resonate with you. You mentioned that, did you go to Bowdoin College? All right. My hero went to Bowdoin College. He was a professor there. His name was Lawrence Joshua Chamberlain. I have his bust in my office. And if you ever saw the movie Gettysburg or read the book Killer Angels, you know what this man did. But if you didn't, I want to tell you it because it will inspire you for the rest of your life. So he's a professor of rhetoric, a law professor in essence. He has a bunch of students, and during the Civil War, they didn't have to enlist. They were, wealthy. They could have hired somebody else to go in their place, but they felt that they should. So they did, and they made the long march from Maine down to Gettysburg, and they were the 20th Maine. There were only 300 of them. They arrived at Gettysburg after the first day of fighting. Now, after the first day, it was kind of a standstill. The North had this ridge called Cemetery Ridge, and at the end of it was Little Round Top. It was a bald mountain, and nobody thought to go up there with the cannons. The South are on the other side, and they are looking at Little Round Top, and they're thinking, if we can get our artillery up there, we can rain hell on the North, and we will win this battle. And if we win this battle, we actually might win the whole Civil War, because both France and England were saying, if you could only win a battle in the North, we'll talk about recognizing you. So Gouverneur Morris, who's the general in charge of the Army Corps of Engineers, also looks up there. And he says, we got to get people up there. But everybody was exhausted from the fighting. And here comes the 20th Maine with their professor in the lead, Colonel Chamberlain. And he says, thank you for being here. Go up on that mountain. And listen, Chamberlain, you've got to hold that at all costs. You cannot retreat no matter what. And Chamberlain, as a professor, understood the stakes. So he goes up there with his 300 college kids, and the first wave in the morning of 1,000 Southerners come after him. But they've got the high ground, they've got rocks, and they're shooting down. So they only lost 100 people, and they killed 1,000. It's pretty good odds. But then the South sent another 1,000 up after them. Again, they shot down from behind their boulders. They lost another 100. Now they're down to 100 guys, and another 1,000 are coming. It's even worse than that. They didn't have any bullets left. And so he sat down with his troops. He cuddled them together, and he drew a pinwheel, and he said, we're going to fix bayonets, we're going to yell the rebel yell to confuse them, and we're going to do a pinwheel because we don't have enough people to cover our flank. And we'll see what happens, but we can't retreat. And this was the first bayonet charge since Napoleonic times. Well, it worked. He bought enough time, and he was injured. His brother who fought with him was injured, but he looked over his shoulder and he looked up at the top of Little Round Top, and now there were 10,000 US troops occupying that field. And after that, the battle was over, really. The war was over. When Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, he had to give his sword over as a ceremonial token. And he said, I want to give it to Lawrence Joshua Chamberlain because I think he was the most important person on your side of the war. And he was also the first person to get the Medal of Honor in the Civil War. I went back up to Bowdoin because there's a little museum for him, and it is incredible. But anyway, if a professor can convince his troops to fight to the last man by educating them, not yelling at them, then we're in the right profession. That's why he's my hero. So, thanks for that, Jim. All right, let's just call it a day.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right.
All right, everybody.
All right. All right. Thank you, Michael. So, we're adjourned for now. Dessert, coffee, drinks, and raising the bar. Have a good evening. We start tomorrow, breakfast at 8 o'clock at the Botanical Garden. Program starts at 8:45.